I have absolutely no idea what Capcom were thinking when they designed Resident Evil Village's first proper encounter, or if they were even thinking at all. Village on the whole is an entertaining mess, lurching between horror and action at the drop of a hat, but it is nonetheless fairly engaging throughout, and it does have a reasonable difficulty curve. However, before settling into that curve, it has one of the most outrageous spikes in difficulty I've ever come across in a game, made all the more ridiculous by the fact it occurs less than an hour into the title. And honestly, it simply didn't have to be that way. To make sure everyone's up to speed before we really get into things, here's a quick rundown of what happens leading into the encounter I want to talk about. Village kicks off with an animated story from the book Village of Shadows, which gives you some insight into what will happen during the course of the game. You then catch up with protagonist Ethan and his wife Mia, snoop on her cooking, and put their daughter Rose to bed, before Mia is shot. A lot. Chris Redfield arrives on the scene, Rose and Mia's body are taken away, and Ethan has a hallucination of sorts, after which he wakes up following a car crash and takes a very spooky walk through the woods. Arriving at the titular village, an old man meets a rather grisly end. Ethan loses a pretty big chunk of his hand, and he then has his first encounter with a Lycan, before soon finding himself stuck in a house under siege by many more. Leaving the house following the siege, there are Lycans everywhere, but the big opening encounter doesn't actually begin immediately. Here's a rundown of how it plays out, as far as I can tell. The Lycans infesting the area will slowly close in on you, but the fight doesn't actually start until one of them begins to let out a very distinctive roar. As soon as that happens, the creepy soundtrack kicks into gear and the Lycans will become a lot more aggressive. From then on, you need to scavenge items from the environment, use houses and the furniture in them to your advantage, utilise crawl spaces, and even clamber across rooftops to survive. Around 2.5 minutes after the roar, the even larger Lycan Urias will also arrive on the scene, upping the threat level significantly, and you'll know he's on his way when Ethan says, "You're kidding me!" And after surviving for a little while longer, at around 4 minutes on the clock, the next bit of damage you take will trigger the cutscene signalling the end of the encounter. It all sounds pretty bloody exciting, doesn't it? There's Lycans and stuff on fire and this massive fella, but when looking at how it's actually designed, well, it's not great. To better understand why, let's quickly cast our minds back to 2005. At the time, Resident Evil 4 wowed those who played it when it brought the series into third person, and its incredible opening encounter in particular got a lot of attention. It was a tense, frantic experience which Village clearly took a great deal of inspiration from. In both, you have to hold your own against an assault by a bloodthirsty group of enemies who aren't immediately hostile. Houses can be used to provide cover, and you can use furniture and their roofs to your advantage. Each has a shotgun you can grab to give yourself a little extra firepower, and midway into the fight a more powerful enemy arrives. In Village it's Urias, and in Resident Evil 4 it's Dr. Salvador. And finally, at the end of both encounters, you're saved by the bell. Here's the scene in Resident Evil 4.
Tenemos que irnos. Lord Sattler.
And here it is in Village. Have you ever heard the phrase, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it"? Well, unfortunately, Village goes in the opposite direction and actually makes its opening encounter worse than Resident Evil 4's. And in my mind, there are 3 major reasons as to why. The first is the design of the area in which the encounter takes place. Here's a map of where you fight the villagers in Resident Evil 4, and apologies in advance for the very crude map markings I'm about to use here. This map works so well because it essentially uses what's been described as a 3-lane system. The 3-lane system is one you commonly see in multiplayer games, but as 4 demonstrates, the principle can also work fantastically well in single-player experiences as well. You have an open, more spacious lane down the middle of the map, which gives you room to maneuver, accompanied by left and right lanes, which are narrower but also include buildings you can use to your advantage. And the left and right lanes also feature several avenues you can use to move back to the central area as and when you need to, so you never run too high a risk of getting stuck in one place. Let's compare this to Village's map for its encounter. There's still plenty of buildings to use for cover, but they're really only placed on the left side of the area, with a lot of fairly narrow paths between them, making it easy to get quickly overwhelmed. There's also this path running down the right side of the area, which can be used as well, but in general, quickly and easily transitioning between different parts of the map is a far trickier proposition than it was in 4. There are also 4 dead ends in total, and it's very easy to get trapped in one before you realise what's happened, which doesn't tend to end too well. Now, that's not to say Resident Evil 4's map doesn't have some dead ends too, it definitely does, but the problem is far greater in Village, and is also exacerbated by the enemies featured during the encounter, which brings me on to Village's second problem, Urias. As I just discussed, Village's map is already narrower than 4's and contains multiple dead ends it's fairly easy to find yourself trapped in, and with that being the case, I cannot for the life of me understand why Capcom then decided that throwing a very large enemy into the mix would help things in any way. If you use the buildings for cover and generally stay on the left side of the map, Urias generally isn't too much of a problem, but God forbid you ever end up in any portion of the map featuring only one escape route while Urias is on the prowl, because then you are in a lot of trouble. In these situations, he is very, very difficult to get past without taking any damage, and Capcom is very, very naive for thinking the narrow map and Urias combine to create anything other than complete and utter frustration. My final bone of contention is again related to the encounter's enemies, this time the Lycans. They are bullet sponges even on lower difficulties, and honestly, at this stage of the game they're nowhere near as fun to fight as the villagers in Resident Evil 4. Giving the Lycans less health so they're much easier to kill would definitely help things, but it's understandable why Capcom didn't choose to do that. If the Lycans are easy to kill at the start of the game, then quite rightfully your expectation would probably be that they are going to get even easier to kill once you start to build up a bit more firepower, and that in turn would create a huge balancing problem for the rest of the game. In their current form, they take so many bullets to kill and the encounter can be so difficult that if you do get stuck, the whole thing feels like an exercise in futility, especially given the limited resources on offer during this section. I went back and played Resident Evil 4's opening again and again after I'd finished it, because improving my skills and dispatching as many villagers as I could was a really fun challenge, but the Lycan bullet sponges in Village's opening ensured that once I'd finished it, I never looked back. Oh, and as a final note, good luck to you if you attempt Village's opening at anything above standard difficulty. I think standard is rather tough to begin with, but having also finished the game on hardcore recently, I'll tell you now, it gets far, far worse the higher the difficulty setting you choose. To conclude, apologies for being such a negative Nelly. As I said during this introduction, I did find Resident Evil Village on the whole to be a strangely paced but very entertaining experience. But hopefully this video also helps you understand why its opening encounter is a steaming pile of nonsense. I have no doubt that most who play Resident Evil Village will have a great time with the game. The problem is, they have to get past its most frustrating moment at the very start of the game first. Thanks for watching the video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, do consider liking, subscribing, etc, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.